Hi everyone, I am SIDHARTH BAIJU, currently pursuing my second year Master of Science degree in Microbiology from the Central University of Tamil Nadu. And today, as part of the seminar series, I'll be discussing about the topic marine ecosystem, wherein I'll be focusing on the littoral zone. So, initially, we'll have a brief introduction about what is the marine ecosystem. So, ecosystem basically is any community which comprises of all the biotic and abiotic components, wherein they live together, they coexist together. And yeah, as the name suggests, marine ecosystem is a complex self-regulating system of living organism which comprises of biotic factors as well as the abiotic factors, and which is present in the oceans and the seas. So biotic components includes fish, other marine animals like dolphins, whales, plankton, seaweeds, mollusks and all. And abiotic components is the dissolved oxygen, sunlight, sea water, temperature, ocean currents, tides, waves, everything. So together these components form a self-sustaining system when energy flows mainly from the sunlight via photosynthesis by phytoplankton or seaweeds, and many other matter cycles and all happen: carbon cycle, nitrogen cycle, oxygen cycle, etc. So talking about the zones of ocean, based on the location and the distance of these zones from the shore, they are divided into littoral zone or the intertidal zone, then the neritic zone and the oceanic zone. So talking about the littoral zone, this is the area between high and low tide, and the key features of it are it alternates between wet and dry and highly variable environment. Neritic zone is from the low tide to edge of continental shelf. Key features is that it is a sunlit zone. It is rich in nutrients, supports most of the marine life and other fisheries. So major life forms are supported by the neritic zone. Oceanic zone is beyond the continental shelf into the open ocean, which is a more wider part. So it is vast, deeper waters is there with lesser nutrients. As the zone increases apart from the shore, the possibility of life there also decreases. Next, next is the division of zone based on their depth range and the availability of sunlight. So first one is the epipelagic zone, which is the sunlight zone, which is 0 to 200 meter in the depth range, where the light full sunlight is there, and life forms such as phytoplanktons, fish, turtles, coral reefs, and all is found in this particular zone. Next comes the mesopelagic zone, which is the twilight zone, which is 200 to 1000 meter in the depth range. Here, faint light falls in this particular range, and life forms such as bioluminescent fish, squid, and all is present here. Next comes the bathypelagic zone, which is the midnight zone, thousands of 4000 meters, so which is more deep, and there is no light here in this particular area. Then deep sea predators and anglerfish and all are particularly found in this zone. Then abyssopelagic or abyss zone, which is more deep, 4000 to 6000 meters. Complete darkness is there, cold. So basically there is no light at all. The visible light, the sunlight is not at all falling in this particular zone, that we can say. So giant squids, sea cucumbers and all are found in this particular area. Then hedal pelagic zone, which is the trenches, which is 6000 meters and plus. So which is even more, it is the very deepest of the zone. So here there is extreme pressure. Obviously sunlight won't be there, another lack of oxygen is there. Extreme pressure can be found in this particular zone. So specialized creatures are found in this particular trenches. After that comes the benthic zone only. Benthic zone is the below the bottom zone, as we can say, is the benthic zone. So yeah, seafloor includes continental shelf to deep trenches, as this figure also represents the various zones. The horizontal division as well as the vertical division, everything is discussed in this particular figure. As I discussed, the intertidal zone, neritic zone, oceanic zone, benthic zone and everything. And coming to my topic, which is about the littoral zone. So littoral zone, the word literally means pertaining to the shore. It comes from the Latin word litus or littor, meaning shore. So basically it means pertaining to the shore or near to the shore. That is what littoral zone literally means. So littoral zone is a part of the ocean or lake that lies between high tide mark and the low tide mark, where land and water meet and conditions constantly changes. So it is also known as the intersidal zone, and is the area of shoreline that has this thing, low tide is there, and it's actually covered by water at high tide. So yeah, after that, divisions of the littoral zone. So littoral zone, as we discussed, is the zone which is to the top and which is near to the shore, and this zone is also, within the zone there are subdivisions. First one is the supralittoral zone. The supralittoral zone, basically also known as the splash zone or the spray zone, is the uppermost part of the littoral or intertidal zone. So it lies above the high tide line, as we can see here. It lies above the high tide line and is rarely submerged in seawater, except during high tides. When high tides come, the supralittoral zone also may be submerged under the water, but when the conditions are normal, it is always stopped. So it is found above the intertidal zone and below the terrestrial environment, receives sea spray and occasional wave splash, but not regular submersion. Then comes the U-littoral zone. U-littoral zone is also known as the intertidal zone, as another name of littoral zone is the middle region of the littoral zone. Basically, it lies between the high tide and the low tide marks, so the mid region. This area is usually submerged during high tide and exposed to air during low tide. During the low tides, when low tide happens, it is usually exposed to the air. When high tide happens, it is usually submerged, and making it one of the most dynamic and stressful environments of the earth. Then comes the sublittoral zone. The sublittoral zone is also known as a subtidal zone. It is the lowest part of the littoral zone, the third subdivision, extending from the low tide mark to the edge of the continental shelf. Unlike the ulittoral zone, it remains permanently submerged underwater even during the lowest tides. So as you can see, the infralittoral zone or the sublittoral zone, which is the lowest part of the littoral zone, even when the tides are lower, even when the lowest tides are there, it is still submerged under the seawater. Okay, next we discuss about the environmental conditions and other salient features that are particularly characteristic features of the littoral zone. First one is the tidal influence. Tides, as we all know, they are the periodic rise and fall of the sea level along the coastline due to the gravitational pull between the moon and the sun and the rotation of the earth. So that is a periodic motion. So tides are the most defining environmental factor, or tides are the most important factor which governs the entire other abiotic factors in the littoral zone. So regular tidal cycles causes periodic immersion, high tide, and exposure causes low tide. So the organisms which are surviving in the littoral zone has to face these sudden changes in tides and all. So these organisms must tolerate alternating wet and dry conditions, as we all know. In the case of high tides, wet conditions will be there. In the case of low tides, dry conditions will be there. The changes in temperature and salinity, physical stress from waves and currents. And for example, barnacles and mussels close their shells tightly during low tide to prevent drying. So these shell organisms, which are particular to the littoral zone, usually cover themselves, close their shells basically as a protective measure during low tide to prevent drying. Then temperature fluctuations also. Temperature changes drastically between day and night or during the wet and dry phases. So during low tide, when low tide happens, direct sunlight heats up rocks and sand surfaces, increasing temperature. When submerged, cool seawater reduces temperature again. So as we all know, another abiotic factor, which is the temperature, that is also governed by the tides. So tide, as I discussed earlier, it is the most defining environmental factor of the littoral zone, because this also influences the temperature and other abiotic factors. So during low tide, as we all know, direct sunlight heats up rocks and sand surface, increases the temperature. So basically, organisms experience these thermal stresses from time to time, and they have to evolve. They evolve themselves strategies and mechanisms within themselves to tolerate these high temperature ranges, because there's a extremity of not really extremity, but there is poles apart differences in temperature when this thing happens. Next is the desiccation or the drying. One of the most critical challenges in the littoral zone is this particular abiotic factor. During low tide, exposure to sun and wind leads to water loss from body tissues. So when low tide happens, the rise and fall of the sea level when the low tide is happening, then the water loss from the body tissues of the organisms particular to the littoral zone will be more. So organisms develop many adaptations like shell or covering to retain moisture, as we discussed earlier. Behavioral mechanisms also will be there, some hiding in crevices or under rocks, and mucus secretion to reduce evaporation. These are particular strategies evolved, adopted by the organisms which are particular to the littoral zone to during desiccation or when the drying happens, that is when the low tide happens. Then the salinity fluctuations also. Salinity changes with rainfall, evaporation and wave splash. So during low tide and intense sunlight, salinity increases due to evaporation. As we all know, when low tide happens, then the sunlight is also will be more. Then obviously evaporation rate will be more, and the salinity in that particular environment will increase. So halo tolerant mechanisms must be evolved, must be adopted by the organisms particular to the littoral zone to overcome this. During rain or freshwater runoff, salinity decreases, so that shift should be there. So organism must tolerate or regulate these salinity shifts, that is the euryhaline species. Yeah, example, periwinkles and barnacles can survive both marine and brackish conditions. Yeah, brackish conditions basically means the saltwater conditions only. Then wave action and water movement. So waves, as we all know, is that basically up and down movements of the ocean surface, mainly caused due to the movement of the wind only. This is not a gravitational pull, basically due to the wind. So littoral zones face a strong wave impact, especially on rocky shores. So waves causes mechanical stress, abrasion, dislodgement of organisms. Water movement also influences oxygenation and nutrient availability. So these things are actually, the waves are also is a major factor which governs the survival of organisms in the littoral zone, because when the waves hit towards the rocky shores and all, then it causes many stresses, as we discussed. Abrasion it may cause. If organism is sticking to a particular surface of the rock, then it will be washed away, it will be dislodged. So that thing and all is there. Yeah, the seaweeds and all which anchors to the rocky surfaces and all have to withstand constant wave impact. Then comes the light intensity, generally high due to shallow depth and clear exposure. Usually littoral zone is in the topmost part of the oceanic zone. So basically light intensity is high here. Promotes photosynthesis in seaweeds and microalgae. However, organism must tolerate UV radiation during exposure at low tide. Yeah, when low tide happens, the sunlight or UV exposure will be more. So that time the organisms which are close to the supralittoral zone basically have to evolve certain mechanisms to tolerate this particular UV radiation, so that it is not harmful to them. For example, many algae possesses protective pigments against UV damage. Then comes the oxygen availability. When submerged, oxygen is obtained from dissolved oxygen in water. When exposed, oxygen is available from air, but drying limits respiration. Yeah, some organisms can respire both ways. Dual mode respiration will also be there. Example, intertidal crabs use gill chambers that retain moisture to breathe in air. Then comes the substrate type. The nature of the shore, rocky, sandy, muddy or coral affects water retention, stability for attachment, type of organisms that can live there. Yeah, substrate type also is a major abiotic factor which governs what type of organisms can survive there. Then comes the nutrient availability. High nutrient input from wave action, decomposition and runoff. So nutrient availability is plenty in littoral zone basically. So because wave action is there, tidal action is there, due to all this decomposition will be there, runoff will be there. So basically nutrient is available for the organisms to consume. So promotes abundant primary productivity. Seaweeds, algae and diatoms and all, primary productivity is increased. So photosynthesis basically is done and supports rich food webs in coastal areas. One of the major key factors of the littoral zone is this. Then comes the predation and competition. High density of organisms, intense competition for space and food. Since it is the topmost part of the oceanic zone, and since it is rich in nutrients, availability of nutrients is plenty in this particular area, then intense competition for both the space and food is done. Space and food is seen within the organisms. For example, predators like birds, crabs, fish are active during different tide phases, leads to zonal distribution of species based on tolerance and competition. Yeah, due to these particular competition and predation among the organisms, there is a distribution of species based on the zone. Zonal distribution as in the sense mainly the zonal distribution within the subdivision of the littoral zone based on the tolerance and competition of the particular organism. Then comes the flora of the littoral zone. Flora and fauna are important factors to be discussed when talking about particular zone. So coming to the flora of the littoral zone, the flora includes all photosynthetic organisms. It comprises of all the photosynthetic organisms, mainly algae, seagrasses, mangroves, and are adapted to changing conditions of the coastal environment. So the littoral zone receives abundant sunlight and nutrient-rich waters and support dense and diverse plant life. So as you all know, nutrient availability is more, mainly algae, seagrasses, mangroves, and all are seen. So photosynthetic organism survival, existence and survival of the photosynthetic organisms is more. Then comes major types of flora. First one is algae, seaweeds. They are the dominant flora. Main producers they are photosynthetic organisms. Green algae like ulva and brown algae like fucus and sargassum, and red algae like gracilaria and gelidium, and are found attached to rocks in intertidal and subtidal areas. Seagrasses, also true marine flowering plants, grow in shallow sublittoral zones. Not the supralittoral zone. They grow in the sublittoral zones, which is the beneath lowest part. And mangroves are also there in the littoral zone. Salt tolerant trees like Rhizophora, Avicennia, found in upper littoral areas, protect coast from erosion. Yeah, that is one of the major important thing of the mangroves, flora of the littoral zone. And talking about the other, talking about the dominant flora of each of the zones. First one is the supralittoral or the splash zone. The dominant flora are lichens, blue-green algae, as we discussed. The blue-green algae, the photos, images are depicted here. And the eulittoral zone also contains seaweeds, red seaweeds and all. It's there. Sublittoral zone also brown algae, everything. Next comes the fauna of the littoral zone. The littoral zone hosts diverse animal life because of its nutrient-rich waters and varied habitats. Organisms here must adapt to tidal changes, wave action, and exposure to air. Since the littoral zone is rich in nutrients, so plenty of organisms habitat is littoral zone. So that provides an actual better habitat for the survival of various of the marine organisms. So basically they have to adapt or evolve strategies within themselves to adapt to the tidal changes, wave action, and other abiotic stress. Like crabs, starfish, shrimps, octopus, and everything are the faunas of the littoral zone. Talking about the invertebrates, crabs are there, mussels are there, barnacles are there. Adaptations are like hard shells to prevent drying, strong attachment to rocks, burrowing in sand or mud. And ecological importance is that decomposed organic matter serves as food for fish and birds and all. Then fishes are there, echinoderms are there, mollusks are there, birds and other animals. These and all are particular organisms, particular fauna of the littoral zone. Adaptations and all will be talking next. So talking about the microbial communities of the littoral zone, among that bacteria, Vibrio, Pseudomonas and Bacillus are the species which are found in the littoral zone. Their main role or function is decomposition of organic matter, nutrient cycling, and some are nitrogen fixers among them. And the cyanobacteria, also blue-green algae, Oscillatoria, nostoc and all involved in photosynthesis, nitrogen fixation, as earlier discussed. Then fungi also, Aspergillus species, Penicillium species, Fusarium species, decomposition of dead organic matter, nutrient release. And protozoa like amoeba and other ciliates and flagellates feed on bacteria and algae and control microbial population. So protozoal species keeps a check on the other microbial species by they feed on the bacteria and algae. There is a constant check or constant control of microbial populations. And microalgae or the phytoplankton diatoms like Navicula, Nischia and dinoflagellates and all are primary producers. And viruses like bacteriophages are also found in the littoral zones. Then comes to the adaptations of organisms of the littoral zone. So as we all discussed, in the case of littoral zone, the tides are there, constant rise and fall of the sea level is there. Then due to that also temperature fluctuations are there, salinity fluctuations are there, oxygen stress is there, and other abiotic stress is there. So organisms has to evolve certain strategies within themselves to adapt to all these changes for their survival. And since there is a competition for nutrient availability also, the survival of the fittest will happen, and based on the strategies that they adopt and evolve themselves to. Then first one is the physical adaptations. Talking about organisms like barnacles or mussels or limpets, their adaptation is hard shells and calcareous plates. Calcareous plates basically is nothing but the hard calcium carbonate shell, which is actually a protective layering which they use. So this can, as I earlier discussed, this can use protection against salinity or desiccation. Basically, when desiccation happens, when during the low tide scenarios, when it is not really submerged, when it is exposed, these mussels or barnacles, they protect themselves from drying by the use of hard shells of calcareous plates. Then comes the seaweeds or algae. They have holdfasts. Holdfasts are nothing but particular root-like structures which is very particular to seaweeds that helps them to anchor to rocks or other solid surfaces. So this can help them to prevent being washed away by waves. When constant waves hit, hard waves hit the rocky areas and rocky surfaces of the littoral zone, as we discussed earlier, when that thing happens, many abrasions and dislodgement of many of the organisms and all can happen. So to prevent that, these holdfasts help, the structural modification holdfasts help seaweeds to anchor to the rocks, and they have flexible bodies also. Then comes the seagrasses. Seagrasses has rhizomes and other root systems, and which anchor in sandy or muddy substrate and absorb nutrients. Then comes the mangroves. Mangroves have stilt roots and pneumatophores. So pneumatophores are basically specialized aerial roots which are found in the mangroves. These adaptations are basically helpful for them to breathe in the waterlogged or oxygen deficient soils. This is a major adaptation of the mangroves, pneumatophores. Then comes the behavioral adaptation, like the organisms like crabs, worms, or clams and all burrow into sand or mud. Yeah, behavioral adaptations that they do to avoid drying out, escape from the predators, and stabilize themselves. They adapt. Behavioral adaptation is adopted by organisms like crabs, worms, and clams and all. Then comes the fishes in tidal pools. So they move to deeper water during low tide. Yeah, when low tide happens, fishes, what they do is that the dissolved oxygen content is necessary for them to survive, right? So basically, when low tide scenario or low tide conditions happen, they move to the deeper part of the zone so that dissolved oxygen is available for them in plenty, and this avoids desiccation and temperature extremes. Fishes can't survive in extreme hot temperature, right? So they move to the deeper part of the zone, deeper part of the water, to avoid desiccation, drying, and other things. Then comes the physiological or biochemical adaptations. The intertidal snails and mollusks and all, wide salinity and temperature ranges, they survival adaptation is done basically by the shells and all within them for survival during tidal exposure, survival from salinity and other things. Cyanobacterial and algae osmoregulation is there, maintenance of the electrolytes and other things within the body. So water balance is maintained in during the case of fluctuating salinity. When the low tide and high tide thing happens, and when the saline nature shifts from high salinity to low salinity condition, osmoregulation within this organism helps them to survive. Mangroves also salt excreting glands or succulent leaves. Succulent leaves are basically the thick or fleshy water storing leaves found in particular mangroves and all, which helps them to survive in saline conditions or dry conditions. Then talking about, we till now we discussed about various adaptations of the organisms in the littoral zone, and also we discussed about the uh, various organisms which inhabits that particular zone. And now, concluding all this, let us discuss about the ecological importance. How is this littoral zone important to the mankind or to the ecology? First one is that high biodiversity is there. So as we all know, nutrient availability is more, other conditions are also favorable, supports a wide variety of plants, animals, microbes, acts as a nursery and breeding ground for fish, crustaceans and mollusks. So aquaculture in a way promotes aquaculture, and mainly this thing is done on the littoral zone only. Yeah. Then primary productivity. Algae, seagrasses and other microbial communities produce oxygen and form the base of the food web. The photosynthetic organisms are there. They are primary producers. That is one major importance. Then nutrient cycling also happens. Microbes, invertebrates, plants and all, fungus, everything. As we discussed earlier, decomposes organic matter. As we earlier discussed, microbial communities, the fungi, the virus, the protozoa, everything involved. Basically, the fungus and algae and bacteria involved in the decomposition of organic matter. Many recycling of the carbon, nitrogen, and other nutrients through various nutrient cycling processes. And the coastal protection also, mangroves, seagrasses and rocky substrates stabilizes sediments. Erosion is reduced to a great extent by mangroves. Mangrove forest protection and everything is very crucial because it reduces erosion to a greater extent. And the food source for humans and wildlife. So as I already discussed prior, it supports a wide variety of plants, animals and all. So it provides shellfish, fish and edible algae and feeds birds and other marine organisms for the aquaculture. Basically, food source for humans and wildlife mainly discusses the importance of aquaculture and how littoral zone supports aquaculturing. An indicator of environmental health also. So changes in species composition within the littoral zone can indicate pollution, eutrophication or habitat degradation. So when the composition of species in a particular zone will be uniform throughout, but when extreme conditions happen, when extreme conditions like when any of the abiotic stress is too much or it is intolerant, then that time we can come to a conclusion that it is actually indication of the pollution, which is actually an indication of a natural indication of any natural phenomenon like eutrophication or habitat degradation. Sometimes the habitat may be particularly degraded due to lack of availability of nutrients or something like that. So species composition of particular zone, here the littoral zone, is very important. That thing is actually a deciding factor of whether the zone is actually rich in nutrients currently or not, and other things, indication of pollutions basically. So we have discussed a lot about littoral zone, the organisms surrounding the littoral zone, the various subdivisions of the littoral zone. Why is it important? Why the ecological significance and ecological importance of the littoral zone, and why it is a paramount feature in deciding the various food and other things of the humankind, basically promoting aquaculture and all, because of the nutrients it harbors, and based on the nutrients it harbors, and the other organisms which it promotes, other organisms which thrives in the particular littoral zone due to the availability of nutrients. We have discussed everything. We have discussed various abiotic factors that govern these the survival of organisms, and the various adaptations which are strategical adaptations evolved by these particular organisms over the course of time to prevent themselves from various abiotic stress like desiccation, high saline condition, high temperature condition, tidal fluctuations, waves and everything over the course of time, so that they can survive in the particular littoral zone. So coming to the conclusion, littoral zone is the dynamic interface between land and sea, encompassing the supralittoral, eulittoral and sublittoral zones. Highly productive, biodiverse, supporting plants, animals and other microbial communities that are uniquely adapted to tidal fluctuations, wave action, salinity changes, temperature fluctuation, desiccation and so on. So this zone plays a crucial ecological role by serving as a nursery and feeding ground for marine organisms, maintaining nutrient cycling and primary productivity, protecting coastlines from erosion and buffering storm impacts. Due to its accessibility, the littoral zone is vulnerable to human impacts like pollution, overfishing and habitat destruction. conservation and sustainable management, and therefore essential to preserve its ecological balance, biodiversity, and resources for future generations. So these are the references, and